Thank you so much for joining us again this week. This is the 8-step series. I'm so excited to have one of our newest folks at Safety and Justice Oregon with us today, Babak Zolfaghari-Azar. I'm going to say it right eventually, I swear to God. And this week we are on step 7. And this step talks about letting judges do their job. So we need to really end ineffective minimum mandatory sentences and track racial disparities in sentencing. I know that this has been a really hot topic that's been coming up as we're, entering into DA races, and we're kind of looking at that realm a little bit closer. Babak, why don't you tell me a little bit about who you are and why criminal justice?
Right on. Thank you so much, Julianne. Appreciate you having me. Yeah, well, as far as background, I'm in this work as someone with lived experience, having been arrested twice in Washington County, one time going to adult jail as a 17-year-old, Washington County jail, and having been through the Court of Appeals and just many interactions with police led me down the road of trying to take that lived experience, get an education, got my master's degree at Portland State around criminal justice, and all this time originally wanted to be a lawyer. And then I got into these situations and I was like, wait a minute, like I want to get grassroots at the front lines working in the community to help folks who are going through the criminal justice system and elevate their voices to be at the center of change, rather than like kind of traditional, we've got, white folks who are in positions of power who may not have these lived experiences, right? Typically, they don't have lived experiences. And so wanting to get people of color to address racial disparities from their point of view, from their experience. And so, fast forward, I've worked in treatment centers, correctional facilities, in the community, therapist, case manager, coach, all those sorts of things. And now in a policy manager position at Partnership for Safety and Justice. So get to really hone in on implementation and really continuing to bring the voices of folks who are traditionally marginalized, really centering policy change around people with lived experience.
Yeah, and I think anybody who's really been tracking like the work to end mandatory minimum sentences is definitely familiar with you. But thanks for introducing yourself to the folks that don't know. And how do the relationships you've built with the kids that you've worked with that are facing mandatory minimum sentences inform your advocacy?
That probably is the number one driver, is those relationships. I think about what kiddos who've been charged with Measure 11, pre-Senate Bill 1008, the Measure 11 Youth Sentencing Reform Bill from 2018 or 2019, both pre and post, there's this sense of hopelessness and really feeling like, like I'm so young, like why is the book being thrown at me? Like I have so much life ahead of me. And, you get you get a very clear sense of how important the other stakeholders in the criminal justice system are, like judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, for example, psychologists, right? Like there's all these folks who don't even know these kiddos who are like in a position of, significant discretion, right? But at the same time, their hands are also tied by legislation, right? By like mandatory minimum sentencing. I've heard many times like, you've come, hearing this from like the professionals in the room, like, man, you really come from like a rough background, like, you've experienced so much trauma, that helps explain kind of, maybe why you were around the people you were with, why you were maybe engaged in the sorts of things you were engaged in. But I can't really take all that into consideration because, this is an assault 2, or this is a robbery 1, like these are Measure 11 mandatory minimum sentences. And as much as I want to treat you as a kid and like give you a second chance, like my hands are tied. Right. So I think about those experiences with kiddos, and that really drives my passion because again, if they can't speak for themselves, like I'm someone who can be an advocate and really speak for those experiences and those stories. So it's a big time driver of the work that I do for sure.
And what do you feel like is, you know, the impact of when, when children's voices get to be uplifted? Or how do you feel like, do you feel like that's much more impactful if we're talking about children than it is when we're talking about adults? And what's the impact of uplifting the voice of those kids who are experiencing mandatory minimums?
You know, just like adults, right? Like people want their voices heard, right? It's empowering. It feels like they matter, right? Especially kiddos, like kids want positive attention, right? And being able to express themselves and share their experiences, is healing. It's empowering. That they feel like they matter, and they also, like younger folks, like our next generation, they know way more than we do. Like I mean, they know different things, right?
Yeah.
And those experiences and those perspectives, I think, really need to be like front and center. I've some of my like some of my like most impactful mentors are not the folks who are adults in my life. They're kiddos that I work with, like in the treatment centers or in the correctional facility or in the community. Their perspectives and the way they're able to, provide fresh perspective on like blind spots, right? And see that like what I have to say matters is really important to their development, their self-esteem, that confidence, right? Which oftentimes, if it's those needs aren't met with positive attention, it goes in the negative direction, right? And there's that attention is being reciprocated in unhealthy, dysfunctional ways that can get them caught up, right, with the police and eventually charges. So I think it's a really good question. I think that the perspective and voice of youth is critical, especially right now. I mean, we're talking criminal justice, but like climate justice, right? Like who's when we're talking about the climate, like older folks who aren't going to be here, like, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years from now, like maybe it's not such a big deal, but like, what about the 10, 15, 20-year-olds who are like going to have to deal with the
Right.
consequences of decisions we're making? So,
Right.
which relates to the criminal justice system as well.
So, and honestly, I appreciate the work that you do. I know that we haven't had too much time to get into like personal stories, but I definitely went through the juvenile justice system. I definitely had my little almost brush with Measure 11, and that it's very scary. Like the system is very scary, and it's very scary for children, and especially children of color. So I just really appreciate your advocacy. But as we're kind of hearing more and more of this like tough on crime approach, it almost sounds like we're kind of going backwards to like this super predator mentality, and this like, do it hard, throw the book at them type of attitude. Why do we even have mandatory minimums? And, do you feel like this comes out of a racially inequitable space?
Yeah, well, historically, looking at as we got tougher and tougher on crime, you go back multiple presidencies, like, you got like the war on drugs and that rhetoric. And then as you get to like the 90s, you look at like Bill Clinton, former President Clinton, and using the criminal justice topic as like a way to kind of win an election, right? Like that 3 strikes and you're out, and mandatory minimum and tough on crime. Like, I mean, that was like the peak, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which really fueled mass incarceration and fueled racial disparities, right? Because the communities that are being targeted with these sentences are communities that typically are more represented by people of color, right? And so strategically, right, you're incarcerating more people of color. You're targeting resources, police, prosecution, incarceration, jails, prisons, all that in communities of color. And what happened was in the early 90s, as that narrative about super predators and people of color being dangerous, and really the other piece of this being like we're being too soft on crime, right? Like locally in Oregon, like, oh, we're letting like kids off on probation for like these serious offenses, which Measure 11 offenses are violent crimes, right? They're person to person crimes. But not everyone who's been convicted or adjudicated on a Measure 11 even put their hands on someone. They oftentimes, like a lot of the youth that I've worked with in the past, they were with a group, right? And they got lumped in, right? And so what happened locally, as this kind of media narrative around being too soft on crime, we're too lax with kids, it's all around like deterrence, right? It's this idea. This is where mandatory minimum sentencing comes from, right? It's this ideology, this idea. It's not evidence based, right? Like, well, the tougher we are, the more likely it is for someone to reconsider their decision in the heat of the moment as a 14 or 15-year-old,
Right.
15, 16-year-old. Well, I shouldn't do this because I'm going to face this mandatory minimum sentencing. And we know that deterrence, right? Brain development, stopping and thinking about your, like, oh, wait, 5 years, 10 months for, this, like, that's not how this works, right?
Right.
It's an idea
Yeah.
that in practice isn't actually effective because, as I learned in the Measure 11 workshops I was doing in Portland high schools and middle schools, is that most youth don't even know what Measure 11 is. Let's put the brain science and the brain development. That's obvious, right? Like
Right.
stop and think, judgment, impulse control, all that. But then even if like 15, 16, 17-year-olds or even young adults, right? Like we're going to have the best like impulse control and judgment and all those sorts of things to make a decision based on a mandatory minimum sentence is just an ideology, right? And we know that there are ways you can have accountability without a mandatory minimum sentence, right? Like there can be there's space of healing and recovery and all that without a mandatory minimum sentence, right? Putting someone in prison for an amount of time where no matter what they do while they're incarcerated, they're not going to get home any sooner. Right. And that creates, like, even in the youth correctional system, right? Like within the Oregon Youth Authority, like a lot of the staff and like the folks who work in those spaces, they don't like Measure 11 because these kiddos aren't very, if you're facing your day for day and no matter what you do, you're not gonna, there's no like incentive or motivation to like better yourself, right? Then it creates safety issues, right? Like you got two totally unmotivated kids with all these, all this trauma and all this like a lack of hope, right? And a lot of fear. And there's not like a motivation for them to do very well. So it creates unhealthy environments, right?
Right. So you brought up something a little bit earlier where you kind of talked about how, a judge can't, even if I'm a sitting judge, I have this person or this kiddo in front of me, and I know that this child or this human has been through extreme circumstances, right? Like the behavior that they're displaying is like typical for the behavior that they have gone through or the trauma that they have gone through. Even if I'm looking at them, if they have a Measure 11 sentence, I don't have the ability to take any of that into consideration, or even their willingness to be, to be rehabilitated. Now, how does mandatory minimum serve to dehumanize the accountability process?
How much time we got? So the fear that I've seen for families who are, right, because it's not just the kiddo, you got, mom and dad and siblings in the room, like, oh my God, like facing 5 years, 10 months, right? And how the amount of days that someone's facing the mandatory minimum becomes such a tool of fear, right? Mm-hmm. I call it fear bargaining, right? Mm-hmm. So most cases are never go to trial. They're plea bargained, right? There's a negotiation to not go to trial to resolve the case before it gets that far. And so typically, it could be a lesser charge, less time, that sort of thing to resolve and move forward, right? Well, in Measure 11 cases, the amount of time that people are looking at creates a situation where there's even more cases that are just not going to trial, and people are afraid. Like, you hear this in the adult system is if you go to trial and you lose, this is what you're facing, right? Yeah. And people don't exercise their right to a trial. There's so much fear, right? Mm-hmm. And so that fear bargaining becomes kind of the pathway to resolve these cases, these Measure 11 cases. Now, since Senate Bill 1008 passed, right, kiddos aren't automatically waived into adult court anymore. Right. You're talking like your most serious violent crimes are even in consideration for a hearing in front of a judge, or then the mitigating circumstances, or like kind of the background, the upbringing, the community supports, that sort of thing, those and all start to matter, where now we're really humanizing, right?
Right.
We're taking the person for who they are and what they've experienced into consideration. Whereas, pre-Senate Bill 1008, it was very much like, it's wild. It's like, you're buying a house and there's all these negotiations back and forth around like prices and numbers, like the amount of days that we're talking about in someone's life. Like, oh, well, pre-Senate Bill 1008, I remember a situation where a kiddo was facing like about a 9-year sentence, and the DA in the county said, well, you know what, we'll raise it up to 11, but we'll go second look, 5.5, right? And it's like, wait, you're talking about like days and weeks and months and years of someone's life, and you're just throwing it out like it's just like, this is a human, right? Like these days matter, right? Like, it's not like a bet in a poker game. Like, it's just, this isn't money. This is like someone's life that you're talking about. And so measure, mandatory minimum sentencing and measure 11, like, put that dehumanizing experience into play and that fear into play. And then the fear too of like, what is my life going to be like after when this is all done, right? Like whether it's I'm serving my full sentence or I get home on like a second look, whatever it is, like what is the quality of life for someone at that point? And when we're talking about mandatory minimum sentencing, we got to be thinking about the whole picture here and like what the quality of life is going to be for someone to be safe when they transition back, because eventually they're going to come home, right? And how many are they going to be able to start fresh and move forward, right? Or are they going to be continuing to live a life where there's barriers upon barriers and barriers, which create more risk, right? More vulnerability for someone to, instead of being safe and making sure they're making decisions that allow them to stay in the community and be free, right? Like that could put them in situations where they're more vulnerable or more at risk for reoffending.
Yeah. So opposite side, we've got a magic wand, right? We waved it, we've humanized the process. In your mind, what changes about Measure 11, and how do we look at, I guess crime and punishment in a way. And I think for me, that word, just punishment anyways, is like weird. But, when we're looking at these things, if we had the magic wand, we waved it, and now we've humanized our process, what do you think that looks like?
Well, I think whatever we do, as long as it's guided by, accountability, right? Healing and safety, then we can get to a place where we're still reaching the same goal here, right? Like, you got to really take in like restorative justice principles, right? Like you've got a party that's a party that's responsible for what happened, and then a party that's been harmed, right? And traditionally, like outside of like victim notification, when someone's like transitioning back to the community, like how involved are people who've been harmed, and how much are their needs and supports really prioritized, right? Like on the front end, there's like, we need your testimony, right? Like for conviction, right? And then years later, like, hey, this person is being considered for like clemency, or like they're going to be transitioning back. Like, but what about all the in between, right? And so I think if we had in this example, like a situation where there was restorative justice and mediation and supports and services for folks who've been harmed, but also for the person who's responsible, because oftentimes, we know hurt people, right? Like there's things that someone who's harmed someone, as far as services and treatment and things of that nature that they need. So wave the magic wand, like there's so much, right? Like I surveyed with the help of interns, I started an internship called Youth Outreach Leadership Internship, YOLI. And YOLIs and I would go into schools and do this education, and we'd go out in the community and survey folks from throughout the state, actually a lot of organizations and community partners in the process. And we try to figure out like how could this look different than what we are doing right now, right? And there were so many suggestions. There was a lot of support for like looking at the specific offenses that are considered Measure 11, right? And there's like about 21 offenses, and bringing that down to a smaller number, removing some of those from consideration as Measure 11. We do under the new Senate Bill 1008, we have second looks for youth. But what about quarterly looks, right? Like what about, because a second look is like at a minimum almost 3 years before someone gets an opportunity, right? To show they've rehabilitated, that they've taken accountability, that they've matured, right? And that they're ready to transition back to the community. So, maybe it's every year and a half on like a 6-year sentence. That's a quarterly look, right?
Right.
Looking at the length of time, this is completely arbitrary, right? Where did 5 years, 10 months come from, right? For the minimum sentence on the lowest level offense, which is a robbery to or assault to. These are just made up arbitrary, scary numbers, right? So that people will think twice about doing it, right? Which isn't how it works in reality. So looking at shortening the sentence lengths, but I think there's a lot that's overlooked as far as, people who've experienced trauma or who've been harmed and how involved they are and how much they are prioritized with resources and mediation and things of that nature. I mean, it's unheard of, right? That a kiddo is sitting with someone that they've hurt, right? And going through a mediation, right? With someone. And, it's go do your time, and victim will let you know, like, when this person's coming back. Like, that's not an effective way that's not justice, right? Like, that is not justice.
Yeah. And I think I've seen, it's kind of like funny to watch kind of what people are able to accomplish when they approach something civilly versus criminally, right? Like I've seen a lot of people approach things, from a civil suit standpoint, and they're able to have somebody take accountability, have somebody admit to what they did, have somebody take an ad out and say, like, this is what happened. And there's just a different level of accountability. And it's like, I know I went through something and the DA was like, well, perfect case scenario, what would you have happen? And I think, we're so used to hearing, I want him to get the max amount, I want the most amount of time. But I think that's because that's all victims have. And, for me, it was like, I want you to publicly admit what you did.
Mm-hmm.
I want people to be able to be careful. I want people to be able to know, that this was at one point your ideology, and to like really kind of have someone take accountability. And I was very swiftly told that's not even an option.
Right.
Like the options are jail, no jail. And that was really all I was really offered.
Responsive.
Yeah, that was all I was offered. And so I totally appreciate you bringing up that aspect of it. So I'm going to just give a quick trigger warning, because this may be difficult for some people to hear, especially if you're watching and you've had experiences for this. But would you mind explaining what the courtroom is like when someone is sentenced to a mandatory minimum sentence?
You certainly feel the life drained out of the room, like any kind of like optimism and hope is sucked out of the room when there's disposition or sentencing on a Measure 11 case. When you're, when you hear like 5 years, 10 months, or, and it just goes up from there, right? So this is not hyperbolic. It almost feels like someone died in that moment.
Yeah.
Like it's that like disheartening and heavy. I'm remembering those moments right now. It's very heavy. And, you can have all the people in the room to like uplift that person and prepare them. But like the moment that gavel hits and it's like official, and you're going away in cuffs, and you're not going to see the other side of that barbed wire fence for several years. It's just a very disheartening, heavy moment. And I think that, you brought a point up previous to this about like what you would have wanted in a situation, right? Like public apology, right? Like public accountability. And, what someone needs who's been harmed or who's, the harmed party, it's individualized, right? And we've oftentimes, what we see in the traditional system is that there's a system response, like we were talking about. It's very driven by the prosecutor and a conviction, and healing and supports and just listening to what someone needs. Like it might be as simple as like, I just, that there could be a financial element to it, right? Like a monetary, the cost of the damage that was done, like the monetary, I just want that paid and we're whole, right? Like, all right, we're back to normal, right? We're back where we started, right? But in like a situation where someone's been, um, attacked by a group of people, right? Like a fight of like two or more people, you're talking about at least an assault too. If there's a weapon, it can be a first degree, depending on like the damage. Something's taken, you're talking about robbery, like, you've got sexual assaults are part of Measure 11, aggravated or attempted homicides, manslaughter. Like these are, again, person to person crimes, very serious, but the response needs to be an individualized response rather than like a arbitrary system created one, right? Which is where we're getting.
Yeah.
So, and also, I mentioned earlier, like prosecutors and judges alike, right? I'm not trying to make any of them the enemy. I've heard them say, my hands are tied. I wish I could do something different and I can't, right?
Yeah.
And like, it's like, we all agree we could do something different. I've had folks who've been victims of Measure 11 say like, I don't want the worst moment of someone's life to define the rest of their life because they're better than that, right? Like, and oftentimes people who've been harmed want to understand like, why did you even do this? Like, what drove you to do this? Why me? Is this going to happen to someone else? Like, safety has to do with also like, not like immediate safety, but knowing in the future I'm going to be safe, right? And like that my neighbor or like whoever you're going to live next to down the road is going to be safe, right? And so, that's almost radical pretty word right now. Like, it doesn't seem radical. It seems like, from my experience, like that's the way it should be, but it's not. That's a very like different way of thinking.
Yeah. And there's like this little thing that I talk to people about all the time when we're talking about like racial equity. And I say, context breeds compassion, right? Like when we have context about either the people who have harmed us or the people that we have harmed, and we're able to humanize each side, each side gets a little bit more. Each side gets to understand a little bit more of that why, or that, how come, or why me. And I think sometimes for victims, that can be a really weird place to live in. Because you don't ever really hear the answer. You don't hear the why. You just hear, a lot of times, you brought this up earlier, you're kind of used to convict. And then there's this whole long amount of time where really your needs are not being met and you still don't know why, and you still feel unsafe. And, there just really isn't a lot of closure. And one of the other things I heard you say, was kind of like this blanket system response, and, which moves us
one size fits all.
Yes, and which moves us perfectly into this, because a lot of people are arguing for Measure 11, for these mandatory minimums, because they feel like that's how we actually get racism out of sentencing, by just prescribing these blanket things across the board. And we've asked a few of our guests now how kind of seemingly race neutral laws actually have had a worse impact on Black folks, poor folks, rural folks, Indigenous folks, other marginalized communities. What's your take on that?
Before I directly respond to that, I've had this word, this value in my head as you've been speaking, and it's truth, right? The truth isn't valued by the system. Person who's done the harm, keep your mouth shut. Do not talk about any details. Don't admit anything, right? Because system response, you admit something, it's going to be used against you, right? And so how much healing is done in a process where the person who's done the harm can't even be honest? Like, say they want to they want to be honest about this and talk about it and be real about it. No, that's not going to help their case, right? And it becomes more about the case than the truth, right?
Right.
And so the truth is something that is missing from our system. You can't really reach how close can you get to like justice and restoration without the truth even being discussed, right?
Right.
And even like when charges are you go from a first degree or to an attempt or whatever, it's like what the person ends up being convicted of isn't really even what they did, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that's all system driven, right?
Right.
That is all system driven. And so the truth is something that should be at the center of this. And it's um, when we look at, like, for example, like restorative justice and maybe opportunities to divert people out of the system to get like to go through a process of restorative to go through a restorative process, then the truth can be talked about. Like what they say is not going to be held against them. And oftentimes for folks who've been harmed and for the person who's done the harm, like being able to be truthful and honest and really develop like compassion and remorse, that's going to help not that's going to help the healing for the person who's been harmed, but also you're going to get a better outcome and longer
Mhm.
term, safety for the person who's done the harm, right? To like, wow, like I like to feel that pain and to sit with it and to see what they've done to someone that can drive them to not do that again, right? And to
Right,
focus their life on kind of giving back and making amends for what happened.
right.
And I know that folks who've done harm feel that way, that they want to, but they couldn't. They couldn't
Yeah,
go there. Maybe they'll talk about it like with their therapist in like the correctional facility or something, right? Or in like a letter or something. But like in the moment to be able to talk about that, it's like not valued by the system, right?
right, right.
So of course, I have forgotten the question that you asked me as we went on that truth-seeking tangent.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
what's your question, Julianne?
I'm here for it. We were just talking about how, oftentimes race neutral, or, these things that a lot of proponents of mandatory minimums are kind of touting this as like a way to address racial disparity, but we have it by the numbers, we have it in evidence, that it has done exactly the opposite of that. And just kind of what's your take on that with mandatory minimums? Um, do you feel like it was good intent? Do you feel like, where'd that come from, and how are we, where are we landing at now? Who does this affect most?
I would start by saying we have significant racial disparities in our system already, right? The and it's in my opinion, it's by design, right? It's to maintain white supremacy, it's to make sure to keep folks, especially people of color, on the margins. We take away voting rights, we have criminal records, like all kinds of, you know, systematically, we've created a mass incarceration to continue to enslave people, right? Ever since the 13th Amendment passed, right? Slavery was abolished except as a form of punishment for crime, and then prison boom, and then civil rights movement, right? In the 60s, we had another prison boom, right? Like after these moments where it's like this illusion of freedom and like equality, right? Like we have prison booms. Hold on a minute, right? And then
Yeah,
fast forward. I think in terms of like I think you said like what was it? Race neutral policies?
yeah, 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 like
Yeah,
race neutral
yeah.
policy.
It's like we got to understand the unintended and collateral consequences of policy change and have like data, like the numbers speak for themselves, right? Like, look at, policing practices, look at, prosecution, and sentencing outcomes, and look at who's going to like, just look at all the checkpoints in the system and have organizations and folks who are, tasked with looking at data to drive and influence decision making, right? And so we can talk about equity and equity and equity. That's all I'm hearing: equity, equity, right?
Like one
And
of my
we can
least
talk.
favorite words. I have to be
Yeah.
honest, like I'm so over it.
Like I
That
mean,
doesn't mean what you think it means. Like,
yeah. Yeah, equity and equality are two different things, right?
yes.
And so like having like race neutral like policies, like I would just say like transparency in the data, having the systems of accountability in place. Like we look at, for example, like in the juvenile justice system, like who's in detention, right? Like who's on electronic monitoring. Like, okay, great, like we've got like eyes and a lens, and we're looking at qualitative and quantitative data to inform, like, oh shoot, we got like there are way for the amount of youth of color we have in our city, there are way too
Yeah.
many youth of color in our okay, how is that going to inform policy change? Like,
Yes.
what are we doing for training? What are we doing for implicit bias? What are we doing around changing practices and
Mhm.
having access to different opportunities and divert? Like, you can just look at every checkpoint in the system and have data to inform decisions, but also it's who's in those systems, right? Like, what are
Yes.
the who who has discretion, right, in those systems? Do you have a workforce? We've been talking about workforce a lot today, actually. You know, what do the people look like? What are their backgrounds like? Are we creating opportunities for folks with lived experience to be in positions where they have discretion and they have influence over policies and practices? And so all those things I think are more effective than like, well, we're just going to have race neutral like policies, right?
Right.
Uh, so that
I
that's
mean,
just
and
a
when
bit
you
on that.
consider like race neutral policies in consideration with the other things that we know, it's like something can be totally race neutral, but if at the base, like the base is already jacked, so we already know like communities of color are over policed. We already know like when you add all those things in there, what was meant to be race neutral just actually ends up just affecting those communities even more so. And I think it's really interesting. I'll be interested to find out because you just hit on something that I don't think I've ever heard anyone else point out to me. But you were talking about how like these moments in history where we've had these like notions of like we might be all right, right? Like we're getting out of this. There's always this like this prison boom or this like violence boom, and it's so funny because all of us, and especially us in the criminal justice world, have been talking about this rise in violence, this stuff that's happening all over the country. And we definitely just had a major moment, like a major civil rights moment. And I feel I'll be interested to see if we don't have the same type of prison response coming after this that we've had in the past. That's really cool because I've never even thought about it like that. But yeah, that's absolutely accurate. And then I got two more questions for you. So obviously, we're talking about DAs. We're talking about how we can tell that a DA is for the people, right? And this step is essential in that. And what can DAs do to assist, in creating an environment where judges are able to do their job? And then also, do you feel like DAs at present, you've kind of touched on it a little bit now, have a little bit more control than they're letting on, or do you really feel like a lot of the time their hands are just tied? Could they be charging people differently? Could they be looking at things in a different manner? What do you think?
Well, as an aside, the 13th documentary on YouTube or
Mhm.
Netflix provides a lot of context around like prison booms and kind of what was going on in society that led to that. So if the audience, if you haven't watched it, watch the 13th documentary. It's really heavy, just warning. It's very heavy and very explicit about slavery and what's happened in the United States up until this day. It's like it's a whole historical perspective, but it puts it all into context. As far as DAs, there are, like Multnomah County's DA's office under the leadership of District Attorney Mike Schmidt. I've definitely seen a lot of change as far as this is concerned, and DAs really seeing the positive impact they can have in terms of not being like this adversarial kind of us versus them kind of relationship dynamic, but like really being invested in the community and trying to be flexible with opportunities to really like, okay, worst case scenario, we're talking prison, right?
Right.
It's not like the go-to, right? And really thinking about the impact of a sentencing decision on, or like plea deal offers, things of that nature, that the long-term impact of that decision, right? Like I see the DA's office in Multnomah County really humanizing the experience for people, and really seeing that this decision is going to have, we can either help influence this person's life so that they are accountable to what they did, that the person who's been harmed is getting the right supports and services to heal and to be safe, and thinking about the long-term trajectory of someone. And I do some, at times I've seen in the past under different leadership or in other counties where kind of prosecutors may hide behind the law, right?
Yeah.
Rather than uh, rather than almost put themselves in the shoes of the person who's accused of a crime, right?
Mhm.
uh and just doing that shows empathy and shows like the humanizing aspect of this that really should drive decision making. I think working in collaboration, getting to know the person who's accused of a crime and trying to understand some of their background and some of the mitigating circumstances, I've seen that play out better in recent years, over the last couple of years, in Multnomah County, in terms of influencing like a plea deal, right? Uh, but yeah, there's a lot of, and I think it's really important for the audience to understand, like DA races are very important to be educated about and to
Yeah.
know how much power a prosecutor has, especially the district attorney who's leading the prosecutors, right? Like the president of the prosecutors is the DA,
Right.
right? And each county has their own DA, right? And they can really influence the culture and the energy in a community, with their rhetoric or their values, their policies. In Multnomah County, like Mike Schmidt started the Justice Integrity Unit, right? And really looking at of the decisions that have been made about sentences in the past, like were these is justice being deceived by this outcome, right?
Right.
And like having like a team that's really looking closer, like neighborhood DAs, right? Like having prosecutors who are like kind of focused on specific neighborhoods and actually understand the neighborhood. They have relationships and roots in that community. We're moving in the right direction in some places, like in Multnomah County, where there's this human relational element, and ultimately that can help prevent crime from happening in the first place, but it can give us better outcomes when unfortunately there is a crime.
Yeah. And then last question, if you could tell Oregon DAs or potential DAs one thing, what would it be?
That one thing would be that any person who's being prosecuted is someone's loved one. It's someone's son, right? It's someone's best friend, it's someone's cousin, it's someone's neighbor, right? Someone's coworker. Think if you can understand, a person who's alleged to have committed a crime, it could be anyone, right? Like, what if it was like your own like sibling, right?
Yeah.
And so I just think at the center of this to humanize and show like that you understand like this is someone's loved one, and that you can achieve justice and there can be accountability in non-traditional ways, and that can actually be more effective for the person who was harmed, right? And for the person who harmed, I think that would be one of the big things that I would want to say.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. We'll be back next week with the last step. We've almost made it, guys. And we will see you next Friday. Same bat time, same bat channel. Thanks, Babak. I hope you have a great day.
Right on. Blessings, everyone.